Hello Year 3, I'm here to read the next chapter of Kids Normal. Chapter 16 is called Expectations. It was February and Murph's hands were nearly frozen to the broom as Carl sent him to sweep the front porch of the wooden pavilion that stood at one side of the playing fields. The pavilion was used by Mr. Flash to store the accessories he used for outdoor CT lessons. Special catapults that fired large clay discs into the air for target practice, huge sheets of corrugated iron, piles of old traffic cones, and the like. The porch itself was scorched and gouged with what looked like huge claw marks. As Murph moodily flicked piles of frozen dead leaves out onto the grass, his heart sank. The whole first-year class was heading across the field towards him, led by Mr. Flash himself. Despite the cold weather, he was wearing his normal uniform of army trousers and a tight black vest. His muscled arms were bare and his breath steamed underneath his ginger moustache in the frosty morning air, making him look a bit like cigar-smoking walrus. "Wow, all the Super Zeros together. Would you look at that?" yelled Mr. Flash delightedly as he approached. Fuzzface and his friends had wasted no time in telling as many people as possible about their nickname for the kid with no cape, and his friends and Mr. Flash predictably had found it hilarious. Murph caught Mary's eye and she made a lemon-sucking face. "Normal, grab us a bucket of nails, will you? Make yourself useful," a couple of Flash's favourites giggled. Murph dropped his broom and trudged into the pavilion. He grabbed a bucket filled with metal nails and marched back outside, where Mr. Flash was waiting with his hand already held out. "Excellent fetching capability, Normal," he leered. "Positively dog-like." More giggling. Murph gritted his teeth and took a breath. "So," continued the teacher, "let's see how Natalie's coming on, shall we? You get on with the sweeping, lad," he added as an aside to Murph. "This doesn't concern you." "Right." Turning back to the rest of the class, Flash roared. "Right. Natalie tells me she would like to attempt to develop her cape to an operational standard. Great to have ambition. Always aim to have ambition, that's what I say. As long as you know that you have an almost completely non-existent chance of achieving that ambition. All right?" He shouted the last word so loudly that he startled a cow fully half a mile away. "In fact," continued Mr. Flash, "let me manage your expectations. Imagine this muffin represents your expectations of becoming a hero." He turned to Murph and held a hand out, clicking his fingers. "You have got to be kidding me," thought Murph, pulling his break-time muffin out of the large coat pocket, where he'd been keeping it safe like a baby hedgehog, and reluctantly handed it over. Mr. Flash threw the muffin high into the air. The class squinted into the bright winter sky as it reached the top of its trajectory and started to fall back to earth. "So the muffin is your expectations, right?" clarified Mr. Flash, adopting a kung fu stance with his left leg in the air. The muffin was almost at head height. Then he moved so fast that there seemed to be at least 8 separate muscly, moustached men chopping at the muffin with their hands. That's not a sentence you read every day, and here comes another one. The air was so thick with crumbs that it was like a scene from the horror film that cakes would make if they had video cameras and thumbs. "Expectations managed?" asked Mr. Flash, licking a stray crumb from the eastern branch of his moustache. "Even if you pass the PCAT and you're in my classes from next year, your chance of becoming an operational hero, of joining the Alliance, is practically zero." Mr. Flash was not what you'd call an inspirational teacher. And here's a picture of Mr. Flash destroying the muffin with his kung fu moves. "Where was I?" he went on in a more measured tone. "Ah, yes, Natalie's been developing her cape, which is technically known as magnetic manipulation." He picked up the bucket of nails, irritably squatting away a wasp that was buzzing around his head. Natalie, a neatly dressed girl with dark hair cut in a bob, marched confidently to the front of the class and took her position in the middle of the scattering of muffin crumbs. "Right. See how many you can get, shouted Mr. Flash, flinging the bucket forwards and upwards so that the nails flew into the air. Natalie screwed up her face in concentration. Murph watched in amazement as the nails stopped in their trajectory, as if a huge magnet was pulling them towards Natalie. None of the nails closest to her flew to the palms of her outstretched hands and stuck there sideways. Others fell to the ground. Now concentrate, said Mr. Flash. See if you can get a few more. Natalie's forehead was beaded with sweat. Her eyes bulged as she strained as hard as she could. Murph could see a nail on the ground not far from him begin to quiver. Suddenly Natalie screamed. The wasp that had been annoying Mr. Flash had flown to her hand and stuck to it, buzzing angrily. A wasp in the hand, as you may know, is worth really freaking out over, and Natalie was really freaking out. She shook her hand frantically, trying to dislodge the wasp and sending nails flying in all directions. Like the world's most twisted piñata, Mr. Flash form blurred, and he rushed to her side, grabbed the wasp and crushed it under the sole of his heavy black boot. As the class clustered around, Murph turned back to his broom, wondering two things. What was a wasp doing flying about in February? And more importantly, why had it been attracted to Natalie's hand? Was it possible, he thought, to have a wasp made of metal? On the other side of town, Nicholas Knox bent excitedly towards his central computer screen. He reached out a long finger, scrubbing backwards and forwards through the footage from his camera drone. He watched the large man darting back and forth with superhuman speed as he chopped and kicked at what appeared to be a bakery product of some kind. He watched the girl with dark hair who could apparently attract metal to her hands like a magnet. He looked at the other children in the class. They didn't seem at all surprised by any of it, thought Knox to himself. Was it possible that they had these kind of powers too? He leaned back in his chair and laced his hands behind his head, plotting like nobody's business. A school, he mused. A very special school. A school for superheroes. He would have to tell Nectar about this intriguing discovery, but not quite yet. First, he needed to know more. Knox spoke into his microphone. All drones, repeat, all drones, abandon assignments. Report to last known coordinates of drone 445 for further instructions. Activate. The small ping noise sounded, and across his three screens the video feeds blurred as his robot wasps turned away from whatever else they had been spying on and headed for the sky, ready to seek out their new target. Murph had scooped up the crushed bits of wasp and decided to show them to Carl. It was now bitingly cold and had started to hail. He bundled himself up as best as he could and headed back across the playing fields, leaning into the wild like an Antarctic hero. He could only just make out Carl's ramshackle collection of outhouses through the driving white lumps that stung his eyes and face, but there was a thin stream of smoke coming out of the tin chimney on top of the right-hand shed, and the hope of warmth was enough to keep him going until a few breathless minutes later he was knocking on Carl's wooden door with a numb red hand. The rasping noise he could hear from inside stopped. There were footsteps, and then Carl tugged the door open. Murph gratefully slipped through it. Morning, Captain Brush. Lovely day for it. Carl greeted him dryly and returned to filing a long piece of metal clamped to his workbench. Carl, can a wasp be made of metal? Asked Murph hesitantly. Carl stopped working and turned to look at him expectantly. Because I was just watching a CT lesson out there, and a girl with magnetic powers attracted a wasp to her hand. Hard to tell without a sample, said Carl, raising his eyebrows under his flat cap. Murph opened his hands, revealing a few paces of smashed-up wasp coated in mud. Carl took them, and together they walked to the back of the hut, where a large magnifying glass was set up on a flexible stand underneath the lamp. Carl poured the wasp parts onto the table underneath the glass and peered through the lens intently. Interesting, he muttered. Haven't seen anything like that before. And this thing was just buzzing around the CT lesson, was it? Murph nodded. Carl looked grim. The wrinkles around his eyes creased together. Looks like someone's taking an interest in us, as we've not too keen on that here. Nice work, Normal. I'll keep an eye on this, and you keep an eye out as well. Murph had a sudden thought. Do you think this is connected to the wasp story in the papers? It's got to be, he decided. Sounds likely, doesn't it? Answered Carl. Now, clear off back into the blizzard and get yourself to your next lesson before you're late. I've got some work to do in there. He indicated a door to the side of the workshop, which Murph guessed must lead to the large area behind the garage doors at the front of the building. It was securely padlocked and had a sign saying, "No admittance under any circumstances," on it. What's in there? Murph wanted to know, along with the rest of us. Carl, one hand on his bunch of keys, ready to open the door, turned back to him and may or may not have winked. "Secrets," he said unhelpfully. "Now scram." Unfortunately, Murph's warning had come too late, because over the next few hours more and more of Nectar's spy drones covered the school. The next day, one managed to get through the window into the CT lesson and witnessed Elsa making delicate icicles appear from the ceiling as she honed her capability with the help of Mr. Drench. Another spied on Mr. Superman as he casually lifted his entire desk up with one hand to retrieve a dropped pen. And it was all beamed back across town to Ribbon Robotics, where Nicholas Knox stamped his shiny shoes in delight. This school could provide him with an army that would be unbeatable. With slaves like this, he could do anything he wanted. This school would provide you with an army that would be unbeatable, Knox told Nectar later that day. With slaves like this, you could do anything you wanted. Nectar's bulbous insect eyes flashed greedily as he sucked on a squeezy pot of golden syrup like a weird giant wasp baby. "And you're sure we can mount a successful picnic?" he asked. "Picnic?" queried Knox. "Attack. I said attack. Mount a successful attack." "Stop mentioning picnics," buzzed Nectar peevishly. "Apologies, sir," bowed Nicholas Knox insincerely. "With time to plan, yes, I'm confident. With your permission, I shall continue to monitor this school and give you regular reports." But Nectar had lost interest already, as Gary had come into the room with a fresh tray of lemonade and a large tub of ice cream. Knox didn't stay to find out what weirdness was about to ensue. He swept from the room and returned to his lair to continue spying. Over the following weeks, Knox learnt much more about the school. His tiny robot wasps positioned themselves invisibly in classrooms, corridors, and in the main hall. On his screen, Knox's greedy eyes read the heroes. He listened to the lessons and eavesdropped on teachers in the staff room. But as winter began to thaw into spring, he overheard one particular conversation that gave him the greatest and most daring idea. Flora popped her head into Mr. Superman's office. "Ian Flash is here to see you, Geoffrey." The head teacher was standing at the window with his hands on his hips, idly watching a wasp that was crawling down the grass. "Ah, yes, thank you," he said. Mr. Flash stomped in, rudely shoving past Flora, who stuck her tongue out at him behind his back before disappearing off to her desk. "You wanted to see me, Headmaster," barked Mr. Flash, sounding as if he had somewhere more important to be, which of course he didn't. "Yes, Ian, I just wanted to check that everything in place for your PCAT next week," said the head. "Anything you need? It's the most important day of the school year after all, and I don't want anything to go wrong." All is in hand, don't worry, Mr. Flash," soothed him aggressively. "It's not my first time, you know. Not that I hold out much hope that any of this lot will be able to make it past many of the obstacles." "Well, not a lot of them usually do, as far as I remember," mused Mr. Superman. "Please try not to injure too many of them this year, though. The whole school will be watching." "But that's what it's all about, isn't it?" challenged Mr. Flash. "A chance to showcase the best of the best, see how they perform against my assault course and 2 actual working Alliance operatives. Oh, yes, so the posse will act as your assistants this year." "Yeah, they'll be my eyes and ears and hands, in fact." "Yes, well," began Mr. Superman. "And legs," added Mr. Flash, "because they'll be running about." "Yes, I understand, thank you," the head cut in. "And while you're here, how is young Mr. Cooper getting along?" "Kid normal," scoffed Mr. Flash. "Who knows? He's off in the shed with Carl every morning now, rather than holding back my CT class. Best place for him. I still don't know what you were thinking, letting someone without a cape remain here." Mr. Superman glanced towards the door. "Yes, with that in mind, perhaps we should keep him out of the way during the PCAT. I don't think a boy without a cape is likely to have much to offer. He might just be a distraction for the other students. Find him something to do during the day to keep him busy, will you? Instructed Mr. Superman. Will do, replied Mr. Flash happily. Listening on his screens on the other side of town, Nicholas Knox realised he had discovered the ideal moment for his attack. It couldn't be more perfect. The whole school would be together. There would be 2 actual working superheroes there. He still couldn't quite believe it. Knox itched to know more about their powers and waited hungrily for the chance to question his slaves. He knew he'd never get a better opportunity to capture himself an army in one fell swoop. You'll never get a better opportunity to capture yourself an army in one fell swoop, sir, he informed Nectar soon afterwards. With my spies guiding you in, you can use the new attack drones to take over the school. If you enslave the most powerful people first, then they can assist you with the rest of the operation. Should present no problems. Me? You're not coming with me? Nectar looked worried. I need to coordinate the operation from here, sir, but don't worry. We'll be in constant contact, and remember, you'll be protected by the attack drones at all times. There is no possible danger, finished Knox, sounding as sincere as possible. And so they began to plan their attack. Murph had really started to enjoy his time helping Carl. Since he brought the metal wasp to his attention, the caretaker seemed to trust him more. Carl had spent hours examining the crushed fragments, but had been unable to fathom out much more about the mysterious machine from the tiny fragments Mr. Flash's boot pulping had left behind. He had taken to patrolling the school with a makeshift magnetic swatter he'd cobbled together in his workshop, desperate to catch another wasp. He was unaware, though, that Knox's technology was far too advanced to let that happen. The tiny drones were too cunning and communicated with each other too effectively to let themselves be tracked down. Carl had also informed Mr. Superman, who had promised to pass the information to what he called the relevant authorities. But as the head teacher hadn't been listening to Carl properly at the time, he came away with a vague notion that the caretaker had been complaining about an actual wasp. In fact, he forgot the conversation completely as soon as it had happened. Carl occasionally discussed the metal wasp with Murph over steaming cups of tea as the wind howled outside the wooden workshop, but without any real information, they had no hope of working out what was really going on. For Murph, the chats also provided a chance to try and wheedle more details out of Carl about his past. He noticed that the box of photographs had disappeared from its place on the bench, and Carl was much too sharp to let any details slip. Still, they both enjoyed each other's company, and the caretaker even let Murph help out with a few of the gadgets he'd spent his days putting together. As a treat, he was actually allowed to take home the odd prototype here and there, as long as he promised no one would see it. One Tuesday, Murph ran home, ready to dart up to his room as quickly as possible to play with something Carl called a grapple gun, a small pistol that fired a length of strong rope that could be used for climbing or grabbing things a long way away. But as he reached his house, he realised something was wrong. His brother had shut himself in his room, and his mum was sitting at the table in their tiny dining room with her head in her hands. As soon as Murph saw her, he knew what had happened. He'd been there 3 times before. Quickly stuffing the grapple gun into a Wellington boot standing just inside the front door, he steeled himself for the bad news. "They're not keeping you on at work, are they?" he said bluntly. Silently, his mum shook her head, then seemed to decide she'd have to say something. "Murph, I'm so sorry," she said unsteadily. "I realise you like it here, but we've been much more like your old self these last few weeks. And believe me, I've done everything I can, and I'll keep trying. I promise." "And what good's that going to do?" Murph suddenly felt furious. "This has happened 4 times now, Mum. Am I ever going to get to stay at a school for more than a year? Or is this it now? Shall I just give up on ever making any friends?" "Well, I didn't know you even made any friends," his mum hit back at him. "You refused to tell me anything about this school. I mean, I am relieved to find you a place, and it certainly seems to have cheered you up a bit. But what's the big secret, for goodness sake?" "Oh, what does it matter anyway?" replied Murph, bitterly turning away. "I'd better get ready to leave it all behind again, hadn't I?" And with that he sulked out of the door and wandered round to stand on the bridge over the filthy canal. The full realisation of how upset he was about this began to sink in. For the first time in ages he started to make friends, but soon he'd have to say goodbye to Mary, Billy, Hilda and Nellie, Carl and his workshop, Flora, even gangly Fuzzface and his goons, all erased from his life, and he was sure but wherever he ended up living after this, the school wouldn't be as half as interesting.